series of fireside chats, and I'm joined today by the Reverend and almost Dr. Nikolai Blaskow. Nikolai preaching at the service that's just been pre-recorded in the Cathedral for our online offerings. And Nikolai is, as well as being a associate priest at the Cathedral, he is the head of the RAVE department at Gippsland Grammar, which sounds like lots of fun. Religious and Values Education is how we unpack that acronym. And recently, Nikolai has also been licensed as Associate Chaplain at Gippsland Grammar, so a man who wears several different hats for us in the Diocese of Gippsland. Welcome, Nikolai. It's wonderful to have a chance to chat with you today.
Thank you, Richard. Also chaplain to the police.
Of course, that's right. Thank you. That's a very important honorary ministry, and one of, I think, 5 of our clergy in the diocese who carry out that task for us. Very, very important, especially given some of the issues that the force has been facing in recent times. So our thoughts and prayers are with them. Nikolai, I didn't get to hear your sermon because I was called away by a provincial bishops' meeting, but you were kind enough to send me your text, which I enjoyed reading, and you focused today, I think, on the Hebrew Bible lesson, the first lesson, the Hagar and Sarah passage, and I love those Hebrew biblical narratives which are so kind of indeterminate. They use gaps and blanks, wonderful narrative artistry, and ambiguities to kind of draw us in to the perspective of the characters in those narratives, and sometimes those who are apparently the more voiceless characters. And I think in that first half of Genesis, God also is such an inscrutable character in so many ways in the story. It's wonderful, wonderful literature. And you used it very effectively, I thought, as I read your text, to draw an analogy with Israel and Palestine in our own age. I wonder, as we approach Reconciliation Week, what a story like that has to tell us about how we might engage with that issue with over 70 million people around the globe displaced.
Well, I'm indebted to James Allison for this insight, where he talks about the innocent victim.
Yeah.
And the series, I don't know if you've seen his series, it's actually a DVD series.
Right. No,
and he talks about, through whose eyes do we look?
Yeah.
So in the Old Testament, and certainly probably in the New Testament too, people would say, well, through whose eyes are you? Which rabbi are you following? And I noticed when Jesus got into trouble with the leaders, they'd say, well, we follow, we follow Moses, we're his followers, he's our teacher. And, the way I linked it with the New Testament reading today is, well, disciple is no better or worse. You're in the same, I'm your teacher, I'm your eyes, I'm your perspective on life, see through my eyes. So when you look at it that way, you then are saying, there is another voice, as you were suggesting, and I deliberately chose Jewish expositors because their struggle with the text actually shows you that it's a real struggle, and that it's actually the editors, whoever the editors were, have deliberately left it in there so that we have to negotiate the truth.
Exactly.
And I think that's a great sense of honour, that God has given us that privilege to negotiate the truth. And I suppose when it comes to reconciliation, it's clear what God's agenda is. God's agenda is unconditional love and, complete reconciliation. You cannot live unreconciled if we are to follow God. So what struck me is that the Jewish commentators, even though they admitted that the story of Hagar was an inverted story of their own expulsion and their own, they couldn't quite bring themselves to say that they're equally as important. In fact, one of the commentators, if you look carefully at the wording, he says that he wondered, given the Israeli-Palestinian situation, it was his comment, Jewish comment. He said he couldn't understand whether we could ever achieve a parity.
Yes.
So this parity is a hard thing for human beings to come to terms with.
So the biblical text, in a sense, holds a mirror to us, doesn't it? And
Totally.
Not always a completely flattering one.
Not a flattering one, and we find it difficult to admit that we have to have parity with our Indigenous people, our First Nation people. So I think it's a wonderful text, really.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether you saw the amusing bit in it. One of the commentators try and justify Sarah being disquieted about the boys playing, and they actually invented a William Tell game where he's playing, arrows. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hit him.
That's right.
I found that really, really amusing.
Yeah.
That you have to invent, which Midrash, of course, allows you to do. They play around with ideas.
And of course, and Nikolai, your own experience, I think, touches on this issue. Tell us a little bit about how you came to Australia.
Well, it's quite a story. It's a long story, but I won't pursue it at great length, but I'll tell you a few amusing things about it. I came out when I was, my mother died when I was born. The day that my mother died, she was 21. Another mother lost her son, and I became a surrogate baby to her. And she actually kept me alive because there was no food around in Berlin in 1946, as you can imagine. Anyway, so I arrived in Australia. When my grandmother died, my father had already come to Australia. He was in Bunagilla migrant camp. He said he has to come to Australia. So the last thing I ever said to my cousins, and I didn't know I had cousins until I was in my 60s.
Wow.
They found me through a sermon I preached at Holy Covenant on being smuggled across the border from Germany to Austria as a girl. Wow. And they said, that must be him.
Wow.
They've been looking for me for 59 years.
The power of preaching.
I know, exactly. And the cousins then wrote to me and said, the last thing you said when you were 4 3/4 was, do I have to go? I don't eat too much.
Oh.
Because they had a market garden
Wow.
of tomatoes, and my cousin and I, we were kissing cousins because she showed me a photo of us kissing each other. All these photos arrived, and I thought, my goodness, I didn't even know I had these.
Wow.
We don't eat too much. And apparently we were there with half-eaten tomatoes, which was supposed to be sold, in the market. But they were never angry because, And I said, do I have to go because I don't eat too much,
But it gives you an insight, I guess, even, so early on in your life, into that experience of displacement.
Mm.
Yeah, and the kind of, incredible existential...
Yeah. You made me nervous now because I'm supposed to be writing a chapter for an international book on the philosophy of displacement. And the beginning point is me coming to Australia. And my memory of the ship. The Nelly was the ship, and it was a converted aircraft carrier.
Yes.
And which was fought at the Battle of the Coral Sea. So I feel that, Anyway, the long and the short of it was, I came here and struggled as all migrant kids do. But I'll tell you just 2 stories that are quite funny, really. The one was when I was learning English, I would hear things like, the Presbyterian, and I remember going with my father, in town, and I looked at the sign and I said, Dad, we can't go across there. He said, why not? I said, it's a Presbyterian crossing. I thought that's what it meant, the Queen reigning over us. I thought she had incredible powers of control over the weather. And then the funniest one of all was my father used to drink in the pub. So we moved to Bathurst migrant camp by then. And we'd rush, to the pub, and I'd sit in the car, and the big fad at that time, when I was 5, was Davy Crockett fad.
Oh, right.
So I used to sit in the car listening to the radio, and the song Davy Crockett, Born on the Wild Frontier, and then I thought it said he was killed in a bar when he was only 3.
Oh, no.
I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm not going in that pub. Particularly with the swill, all these people come rushing out of the big swill. Yeah. And I said to Dad, I said, I can't go to that pub. I said, David Crockett was killed in the bar when he was 3, and my father was going,
But again, that language...
And you know what it was, don't you? He killed him a bear when he was only 3. But I thought he was killed in a pub, which he probably was. Being a migrant person, I'm very...
But lovely anecdotes which kind of, mask the real challenges of that kind of acculturation.
Absolutely, but the one that you'll like most is this one. When I was in East Balmain in 5th class, we were in right opposite the church there, purist.
Yes.
My father was an atheist. And I was sitting there and I heard the lady next door, the blue ring set, sort of, she had a blue ring through it, and she was smoking, and pardon the, I do apologise for swearing here, she was saying, these bloody daggos, they come to this country, and there was a smoke drifting past, and I'm thinking, my God, that's me. And they take away all our work and everything, and I thought, my goodness, that's me. And then I went out to get a bottle of milk, which I was asked by my father, and we both came out, and she looked at me and I looked at her, and she said, hello, darling. And that's remained with me because I thought the heart of Australia is for people once they have a face and a name.
Yeah.
But if they don't have a face and a name, then they just, give into abstractions and stereotypes.
Yeah.
So I'm a dago, Richard, I hope you...
It's a cautionary and a salutary tale, Nikolai.
My father reacted, obviously, in a very defensive way when he realised that the cousins had got in touch with me. And they said basically to me, did you know that your mother was raped by Russian soldiers? And I said, I beg your pardon? They said, yes, did you not know that? I said, no, my father has never said anything of that kind. But of course, when I was teaching modern history, I was always conscious that 90,000, Berlin women were raped by Russian soldiers, and they came and they said, this is for Stalingrad, So when my father heard that that's what they were saying, so I'm thinking, I was thinking that Russians are coming in, and he always liked to tell the story that he went out, and because he was Bulgarian, he could speak Russian. He had his father's watch that given to him. He got a scholarship, by the way, to go to Berlin and to train in Greek and Roman history. Wow. He had some of the best lecturers in the world, and he produced this watch, and said, and they had these soldiers with watches right down their arm, and he said, I prevented your mother from blah, blah, blah. But my mother died because of complications in childbirth and septicemia, and I was premature by probably about 3 weeks, perhaps 4, which of course in 1946 is almost like a death sentence. And but then I've written a film which is still in abeyance, waiting for it to be rewritten really, because I was too emotional at the time when I was writing it. And it wasn't it wasn't like one of these boring personal things, but I had universalized it, and it was about a child trying to come to terms with the truth after so many years of living this lie, And anyway, I finally figured it out, that I think what happened was, because he then threw it back at me, well, they couldn't have done that because they came in 1945, not in 1946. Well, I think my theory is, here's a Russian soldier, ripe with PTSD, who looks at my mother, she was a beautiful, absolutely stunning woman, at 21, and saying, how dare you have a baby when maybe, my fiance or whoever he knew had been raped by German soldiers coming in, and then I'll deal with you. And that's what I think happened. I honestly feel, because I am my father's son, clearly, but and that was very hard for me. It was hard for me because number one, he claimed to be a Christian, and he lied about it, and I had my cousins have to tell me, and only by the slenderest of opportunities were they. And it was a sister, a cousin, who actually said goodbye to me, who told me that that's what I said, that I don't want to go, do I eat too much? That's how I knew that I'd said that. She was 20-something, same age as my mother, thereabouts, and they lived together, they knew each other. He hadn't told them that she had died for a year. So clearly there's a lot of... He also worked in the German Foreign Office under Ribbentrop, and I don't know whether you follow, you're probably interested in history, but the top German historians now have discovered that the Foreign Office knew all about the Holocaust. But my father always, and he used to go over and over it, trying to prove the point that Bulgaria was different from other countries because King Boris told Hitler to get lost, he wasn't going to release his 30,000 Jews, which is commendable for Boris, but why is my father keeping on telling me that story? And I feel that he knew about the Holocaust, and I think there are a lot of things I will never know. But and then my uncle, who was my mother's brother, was so upset when she died. When he heard that she died, he joined the French Foreign Legion shaved his head, changed his name, and got landed in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which was the most horrific. He had to kill kids who were 15 for them. And that's why I think that's why I found it very hard to forgive my father. But I had to, and I did. And the last thing, he came to Canberra for an interview, to vote for the Bulgarian elections. And he'd never gone out of Sydney, so I had never seen him in a social context, but he'd shrunk about half his size, and I didn't even recognise him. But I think, because it's PTSD, I think if you admit to it, he'd convinced himself that this was the truth. And I hold no animosity for him on that. But the fact that he called them all liars was very hard for me. And I think of my, First Nation peoples, they've got many more things to complain about than I have.
Perhaps let's steer back onto that, because I was going to ask you, Nikolai, how did it feel when your cousins kind of suddenly joined the dots and worked out who you were, and then reached out to you, went to all that effort to find you and reconnect with you? What was that like for you to be drawn back into that household?
It was beautiful, but also very, very saddening, because I realised the person that I'd always remembered, I didn't realise that was my cousin. I thought it was a person that had taken pity on me or something, And
so there's grief in there as well, because there's kind of a sense of what you missed.
It's the only time that I've ever thought to seek psychological help, but I didn't find it there. I found it in Christ. I found it in the genuine act of total forgiveness and unconditional love. That's where I learned it there.
And so when we think of our own First Nation peoples and the stolen generation in particular, and what their experience might have been like, we'll never understand it, of course, but in the sense of those who've been able to reconnect with families of origin and households and extended kinship groups, the incredibly complex mixture of feelings that they might experience in that process.
Totally. I've got some very good Indigenous friends. One is Darlene Johnson, who's a film director. She's done, the Red Phone story, I think it's called. She directed, and she was actually part of that whole scene. So I've always had this very strong affiliation with my brothers and sisters who are Indigenous, and I have a few, close people that I would like to move further in that direction, really, but I haven't up to this point found it. Nicky Moffat. I've got very close to him, but he's so far away, we just haven't quite.
Sure.
But I'd like to continue dealing with him, deep listening.
Nicky played the Didge when I was installed here, which was
such a wow! I didn't realise that. Wow.
But the film you showed actually in youth group last time that my kids enjoyed so much. In My Blood It Runs.
Yes.
That's really interesting in the light of this, because the young boy, Duan, in that film, the 10-year-old Arenti boy, he's not part of the stolen generations as such, and yet he still experiences the kind of violence of exile that is imposed on his community because of the pressures of assimilation. There's still today those, even in the education system, that's the public education system that's meant to kind of empower the children of that community. It still drives this wedge between their LORE law and our kind of, version of history, or our experience of this nation. So there's still he still has to, his Aboriginality in a sense is driven inwards into the domestic space, nurtured by his grandmothers. And what belongs in the public space is kind of denied him, and that's another form of stealing, isn't it?
It's been stolen from him. That's why I'm doing The Matrix now. We did the Batman trilogy with ethics, and now we're doing The Matrix 1 and 2 with philosophy, and the red pill and the blue pill is mine. So just
as in your sermon.
As in my sermon. So I draw, and I didn't explain this, probably wondering what the hell is the red pill. But anyway, it's just this thing of, the struggle to see it for what it is hard. It's a hard struggle, and I feel for my conservative Christian friends. I was going to say before, I thank my evangelical background. I really do. And I went to Bible college, and, and I had what did I have? I had a Presbyterian, director of studies. I had a open brethren, registrar. I had a Baptist Old Testament exegete, etc. But I was very dissatisfied. I was thinking, this is, particularly the premillennialist view. I think it was like a roadmap to how to get lost. But I loved the moment I got onto the Melbourne College of Divinity, and I started reading Bultmann and Tillich. I thought, oh my goodness, this is exciting. There's no fear in love, and there's no fear in knowledge. I often say to my good friends, my good evangelical friends, if you believe that Jesus is the truth, you've got nothing to fear. Research is truth. Good research is truth. Embrace the truth.
The truth will set you free.
It'll set you free, every time.
You mentioned in passing there your writing, and I referred to you as the almost doctor.
Yes.
Because, of course, you're in the latter stages of climbing that mountain, which is the submission of a PhD thesis. And as I understand it, Nikolai, your thesis is really focusing on Friedrich Nietzsche and one of his better readers in René Girard and others. And perhaps not a widely known figure, famous philosopher, obviously Nietzsche, but perhaps not widely known in church circles, although I did, strangely enough, had the opportunity to quote Nietzsche in a sermon the other day, which doesn't happen quite often. But I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about your research and how it might relate to our kind of context in the church.
Certainly. I call him Friedrich now. He's on first names basis.
Well, your German's much better than mine.
Anyway, my thesis is on resentment.
Yeah.
So the moment you say, my thesis is about resentment, people instantly, they're interested because everyone feels resentful, right? But the argument between Nietzsche and Girard is that Girard gets upset with Nietzsche because he accuses the church of being born in resentment.
Yeah.
And my thesis shows categorically not that it's a great new idea. That's not the main thrust of the idea. My thrust is slightly different. But I actually demonstrate that his primary audience is the church, and particularly the Lutheran church of his day. Luther, a lot of people don't realise that Luther actually admonished and encouraged his congregations to go and burn down Jewish houses. And of course the Lutheran element in Germany made Germany vulnerable, to this kind of indoctrination, because as with the Catholic Church they thought letting his blood be upon us meant that the Jews deserved everything they got because they killed God, So Nietzsche, I think almost ironically, in a very provocative way that Jesus does with his parables, he deliberately sets himself up as the Antichrist. And essentially his last book, which was Ecce Homo, which of course is taken from the Latin Vulgate, which says Pilate's words, behold the man. So he called himself the Antichrist, and Ecce Homo is his last work in which he reviews all of his life's work. He's basically putting out a huge hint. If you want to understand my work, you have to put me in the place of Christ on the day of judgment, when Pilate made his judgment, behold the man. So if you're as foolish as the crowd on the day, and you thought that Jesus was a blasphemer for what he said, and you think because I've said the Antichrist that I'm actually the Antichrist, then you're a fool, and you're actually joining the crowd, and you're obeying the crowd for blood in the way that they did. So you will not understand my work unless you stand with me in the place of Christ. So ironically, his identification with Christ, as some of the Girardian critics have admitted, he understands an identification with Christ more clearly than many Christians do. They'll give him that, but they can never follow through because they don't understand, they cannot see through the satirical side of his work. And Ecce Homo, from another point of view, from another Professor Moore, he argues that the whole thing is a satire, a Roman satire, based on a Roman satirical writer, because he was into the classics, Roman and Greek classics. And he's basically just making fun. He's saying, okay, come, do you understand? Do you understand who my primary audience is? It's the Church of William II, of Bismarck, and the nationalism and the anti-Semitism. And what I find most curious of all is that people accuse him of being an anti-Semite, which of course he was completely not, because his sister was an anti-Semite, and he didn't speak to her for 2 years because of that.
So in a sense it's another mirror for us. He's holding up another mirror.
And he's very true to the Jewish model of midrash and asking hard questions of the church and of William II and the whole nationalism thing.
Precisely the sort of hard questions you were asking of the text today in that same tradition.
Well, that's why I'm attuned to it. I'm almost, because of that,
And I think it's great. We do need to, as the Mother Faith is so, kind of such a great exemplar of that capacity to really wrestle with the text and to do it in a very reverent way, very robustly.
Totally reverent.
Yeah. So.
And you come out stronger for it.
Absolutely.
This is why I feel that, and I say this with great love, because when I became a Christian, which was at 19, I was at Sydney University, and I'd been to a Bible study where they were studying 1 John 1, and the verse went, he that we have seen with our own eyes and heard with our own ears and touched with our own hands, we declare to you. So smart ass, if I may use that word in its best sense, Blaskow gets up and he goes to 3 poor unsuspecting members of the Bible study. He says, have you seen him? Oh, you haven't? Really? Oh. Have you touched him? Oh, you haven't either. Have you heard him? No, you haven't either. Oh, well, you're all wasting your time. So I walked out thinking, Blaskow, you've done it again. And then 3 weeks later, I'm on top of Fisher Library talking to a very earnest guy who actually became a professor of philosophy, curiously. And he was trying to explain to me the Trinity. And I was looking across at the city, from Fisher Library, across there, and God spoke to me as an atheist. He said, Nikolai, number 1, spoke my name. What are you going to do with what you know? It completely floored me. Like, he was going on, and I was just in the... And I tried so hard in that moment to say this is just my imagination, but it wasn't. And I thought, if I don't accept this moment, then I'm worse than the biggest hypocrites in the church that I always, So God said, okay, let him have his day here, but we're going to catch up with him over there. So that was really wonderful.
Very Augustinian in a way.
It is, isn't it?
And Nikolai, you mentioned you came to faith as a teenager, and in your work at Gippsland Grammar, both in the chapel and in the classroom, you engage a great deal with teenagers. And I think sometimes in our churches we lament the absence of young people, and we perhaps can make assumptions about where younger people are at in terms of questions of faith and spirituality. You always report a very deep degree of engagement by students with these kinds of questions. Tell us a little bit about your sense of where that younger generation might be at, with their wrestling with those questions of faith and values, as against perhaps their relationship with more institutional expressions of religion.
Well, I'm not all that perturbed by the fact that young people aren't in our congregations in the numbers that we would like. I would love to see the church full of young people. Everywhere I've gone, I've always started a youth group, and we'd start with 3 people, and I can remember once in one church, the 3 who were very happy with their little association, when a new person wanted to join, they said, can we not have him join, because we're really happy the way we are. But anyway, after that little hurdle, we ended up with 30, and it just went from there, and so on and so on. But no, the young people are very astute observers, and even if they might be a bit bewildered and whatever, they have a great sense of truth and reality. And I always say to my students, in fact I shock them in a way by saying, don't ever despise an atheist, because I've always got some fairly conservative students in my class. And I said, don't despise atheists. I said, a good atheist is an atheist by persuasion, an atheist who is a protest atheist, who's saying, I can't believe.
Because...
You're forcing me to believe when I can't believe? That's a case of integrity, So I always say everyone has a seat around the table of discussion. And of course you can go home and speak to your atheist parents, because they have every right to speak. I want to hear what they have to say, you know. And I'll tell you a funny story. I was going forth one time in Chaplain, and I was saying, you know, and you have to be honest. I said, I was an atheist and I was honest, and, you know, and I changed my mind, and even though I thought I was going to make a fool of myself. So anyway, you know how sometimes, I don't know why I did it, but I put my name into the Google and to see if I was being mentioned by anybody. And there was a student in my class that said, and you know, our chaplain, Nikolai Blaskow, he said that you've got to be honest. And he was honest and he became a Christian. He said, I was a churchgoer and I've become an atheist. So anyway, I went
to go both ways, I guess.
I went into the staff room and I said, well, I've got my first convert. And you can see the science department, you know, going like this. I said, it's all right, you can relax. He became an atheist. So, and I think that really disarms people, you know, and I've noticed at Gippsland Grammar, there's one particular person who, obviously I can't name, but he is such a delightful man. I mean, he's a complete and utter committed atheist. But he's really starting to come around, I feel. I really do, because I'm being real with him, you know. I'm saying, of course, and you know how Patrick White became a Christian, don't you?
Well,
he's our only Nobel laureate.
Yeah.
He was out in the dog kennels and slipped and fell in the mud and shook his fist at heaven, and he became a Christian. You know, like, how could you possibly predict something like that?
Yeah.
So everyone has their moments, you know.
Yeah.
And God loves everyone equally. That's what somebody said once. Trouble with you, Nikolai, and they banged their hand on the library desk. You're a universalist. And I thought, oh well.
There are worse things.
Actually, I don't mind that label. I do universally want everyone to be, to be in God's kingdom. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah.
No, I love the young people. They've kept me honest all these years, and you can tell when you're saying something, and they're getting it, and they're thinking, my God, he might be right, and if he is right, what do I have to do? You know, which I think is such a wonderful moment. You know, really is.
And when you had your change of mind, change of heart, that very powerful experience you described earlier, at just 19, what was the journey from there, from that point, that kind of awakening into ordained ministry? How did you discern your calling?
It was very, very funny. My first wife Ellie died, and she was a wonderful Christian person, and I went to St James King Street where Susanna was a preacher, and anyway, long story short, I could tell you about the butterfly, but I'll keep that for another time, for another interview. But she had organised, when we started going out, she then organised a day, and I said, look, I'm marrying you, but I really want to support you in your ministry. And I had been a missionary, of course, on La Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean, and which is another story in its own right. But anyway, and I said, no, I really want to support you. So anyway, the funny thing was, in this retreat, we were supposed to go out into the town and follow our leanings. So I did, and I ended up at St Mary's Cathedral. And I'm thinking, oh, this will be a nice place to go to. And the place was packed. It was St Patrick's Day, and I didn't even realize. So I was ushered right to the back of the cathedral, and the Archbishop of the head honcho in Ireland, he gave the mass and he preached. And as he was speaking about the call of St Patrick, it was absolutely just a bit like the moment on Fisher Library. It was like a little tapping on the window. Nikolai, I think you might need to consider this.
That's a great image, the tapping on the window.
The tapping, it wasn't a banging, it was just a little tapping, And the thing is, when he came out, he came from behind. I was in the back row. He shook my hand. And he said, welcome, etc. So that's how it was called. It was at that mass.
And sometimes it's those, very kind of personal moments, a handshake, a gesture, a word that comes from another embodied human being that God can reach out to us through.
Because I wouldn't have listened to him if I hadn't shook his hand. And he was like, St Mary's Cathedral, like you need opera glasses to see him.
Well, Nikolai, I think you're a living example, a wonderful example of the wisdom of the legislation that we implemented at the last Diocesan Synod to enable people who've reached the age of 70 years and 10 to actually be fully licensed and to continue in that kind of capacity in their ministry. And it's wonderful to be reminded of just how much clergy and lay people have to offer in their 70s and well beyond. And often at the height of their powers, with all the wisdom of life's experiences and lots of energy and passion.
Yes.
And here's you, working on your doctorate and doing all these wonderful ministries for us in so many capacities. So thank you for all that you do for the diocese, for the Cathedral Church, for the police force, for one of our Anglican schools here in Gippsland, and for the intellectual life and energy you bring also to the town, because you've opened up a philosophy group here in Sale, is that right?
I am. I'm on the verge of doing that in Bond Street.
And
we had 40 people turn up, by the way.
And
40 people.
You were quite surprised that there was that kind of level.
Well, the guy who ran the place was completely flabbergasted that there were so many interested. Yeah.
And I think your first session was on Nietzsche. And so, fancy 30, 40 people coming out to talk about Nietzsche,
Well, it was on climate change. Admittedly, I used a hook, which was, what do you do when, a million climate change refugees come to our shores? What will you do? So that was a bit of a hook. But they came, the first time there were 20, and the second time was over 40.
Yeah,
so it's definitely on. But of course, the viruses interfered. But no, and the kids love the philosophy. You can tell. It takes them a while to get hold of it, but gee, I taught theory of knowledge in the International Baccalaureate for many years, and I was at International Baccalaureate principal.
That's just Annie, the cathedral cat, getting into the paperwork here.
Yes, well, I think I might just... Annie, I don't think that's a very good idea. Thank you. No, Annie, thank you. You're a silly sausage. You only did it for 10
It's an active parable.
An active parable. You're just doing the paper again, aren't you?
But it just it reminds us that there is that appetite for engagement, for learning, for wrestling with these issues and ideas, and we can often assume wrongly that there wouldn't be that kind of level of interest.
I'll just give you a very quick example. Now, this is one of my most disengaged students, but he's very good at cricket.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to teach him. In our teaching strategy. We have what we call basic, deeper knowledge, and then you've got transfer knowledge. Now they're quite complex things to explain. So I used cricket with him. I said, this is what I did with the team. We used to play Knox, so you know Knox. They were always vaunting it over Barker, And I thought, now how are we going to beat Trinity too? I went to Trinity from Barker. I went to Barker first. So I said, how are we going to beat this team? So I had a guy, he's a middle order batsman, and he was a pinch hitter. So he'd always get out at 38 or 40, right?
Yeah.
So I thought, if that's his inclination, why not put him as an opening batsman? And we'll put all of our good batsmen, careful batsmen further back, that the ball gets worn away a little bit, and then they're ready for the, He absolutely demoralised them.
Yeah.
I said, that's transfer knowledge. You can be very good at the crease, you can know all of your technique and get it all right, but the transfer knowledge is to think in the other person's shoes, and that's called transfer. So you're taking your knowledge of the game, but you're applying it to the person in front of you in a different kind of context. You're not thinking about yourself, you're thinking about them. And he got it, I could tell. And he was sitting there, I could tell he was really annoyed that he'd got it almost, because he didn't want to get it. But
he had to engage, because you met him.
But he got the cricket. He got the cricket analogy.
See, it's the two great principles of education. Work with who's in front of you and start where they are. That's a wonderful example. And of course, as Nikolai alluded to, he coached cricket and taught it at my old school. So Nikolai, I feel like our kind of paths have crossed like sliding doors over the years.
Third 11, the fourth 15, fourth.
And it's wonderful to work with you as a close colleague here in Gippsland. And
thank you.
Again, thank you for your ministry to us through the service today, and also for sharing so much of yourself with us in this conversation.
Thank
We
you.
really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Yeah. Blessings.
And you.
Mm-hmm.
Amen.